Is it too early in the morning for you guys?
Too early?
I'm from
Okay.
the US.
So good evening, everybody. A very warm welcome to all of you on behalf of Tushita. We are indeed very fortunate to have with us Venerable Tenzin Priyadarshi today. And I'm so glad that he accepted our invitation. He was here with us a couple of months ago, and he's flying out tomorrow. He arrived in Delhi this afternoon, so he's in transit and he's agreed to do the presentation. But more than that, I requested Venerable to offer a prayer for Venerable Lama Soka Rinpoche, our spiritual director, who passed away recently. So thank you very much for me. Just a brief introduction to Venerable. Venerable Tenzin Priyadarshi is an innovative thinker, philosopher, educator, and polymath monk. He is the president and CEO of the Dalai Lama Center for Ethics and Transformative Values at MIT Boston. Venerable is one of the finest masters of the time. He received his undergraduate degree in philosophy and physics, and graduate degree in comparative philosophy of religions from Harvard University. At the age of 10 years, he entered Buddhist monastery in Rajgir, near ancient Nalanda University, and was subsequently ordained by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who is his spiritual mentor. Venerable Tenzin lectures internationally and is also the president of the Prajnapaya Foundation, a worldwide humanitarian organization. So may I now request you to please give a teaching on developing Bodhichitta. And let's start with the prayer. Thank you.
Please. Anirodham anutpadam chedam ashashvat anekarthamananarthamanamamam nirvam yapradita samutpadam prapancho pashmang shivam deshyama sambhastam vande vadavam buddham gacchami sharanam yavada bodhi mandata dharmam gacchami sharanam bodhi sattvaganada sarvasa diksha samadhan prarthayami kritanjali Dandadipam kurvantu mohadadu pravadinam Akashasthiriyavadiyavacha jagadistitihi Tavanam sthirabhuya jagad dukkhani nignadaha Manjugosham namasyami yat prasadan mati shubhe Kalyana mitrang mandeham yat prasadach vardade Namastore ture vira tuttare bhayanashini Ture sarvature kale swaham karang namamyaham Ye dharma hetu prabha hetum tesham tadavde It's a delight to be here this evening. And I was in Rajgir actually, at Vulture Peak for a few days this month. So got the news. What was it this month? Last month, I think. Got the news of Lama Zopa's transition. So I had many occasions to meet him, spend time with him. I think even at your house, we were there. And of course, I admired his commitment not only commitment, but his lack of sense of time or being attached to time. I think those who studied from him know what I'm talking about. It was a wonderful experience how to be with somebody who's not trapped in conventional sense of time. So on one hand, of course, there's a sense of sadness of passing of a spiritual friend who was teacher to many. But on the other hand, there is the sense of hopefulness that he'll be back in a healthier, more energetic body and continue his work. And probably be back in a time when we'll need him the most. That's the way I am looking at a lot of my aging teachers as well. Last week I was in Dharamshala, and then I had to spend quite a bit of time. And when you see somebody regularly, it's one thing. When you see somebody after like 6 months or a year or 3 years, in the case of pandemic, you recognize how people age. But whatever time we have, it's of great fortune, and not to take that for granted with the teachers. So I'm joining many of my other spiritual friends of Lama Zopa, praying for his swift coming back. Partly jokingly, partly not, which is that Bardo might be the only time he gets to rest. So, so yes, it is swift return, and much work to be continued. I think this evening thought about just touching a bit on Bodhichitta, development of Bodhichitta. I think last time I was here, I was talking about the four immeasurables when I was here some time back. And four immeasurables are generally a good sort of ground, or the practice of four immeasurables is a good foundation for cultivating Bodhichitta. It's a good precursor for that. Bodhichitta, of course, is something that you come across in your study and practice of Buddha Dharma. This past week, I was in Dharamshala. Just landed this morning, this afternoon. And I was with a group of some very wonderful scientists for a different kind of meeting. It was about animal consciousness and sentience. How do we recognize sentience and other organisms and so on? But as a result, we had a lot of discussion on chitta, on consciousness. And one of the interesting things in Buddha Dharma, echoing, of course, some of the descriptions, not description so much, but understanding of consciousness or chitta in other Indian philosophical traditions. But one of the interesting things in the Buddhist tradition is the amount of categorization with respect to practice in terms of transforming consciousness. And it's not just transforming in terms of the kind of consciousness. It's not like, uh, a type of consciousness, but transforming even in terms of the degrees of consciousness. So starting somewhere and then with respect to one's practice, beginning to look at degrees of awakening. In certain traditions, regarding it as sudden acts of awakening. In other traditions, sort of a gradual process of awakening. And Buddhist tradition is open to both of those examples. In China, historically, when Buddhism went to China, there was a debate about what became sudden school of enlightenment and gradual school of enlightenment. And the whole debate was about how sudden is enlightenment or how gradual is enlightenment. But nobody gave a time frame. They all sort of argued whether it was a sudden awakening process or a gradual awakening process. But nobody sort of gave you a time frame of how sudden is sudden or how gradual is gradual. But in much of the Tibetan Buddhist traditions, and again, there are exceptions, as both of these point of views are evident in practice, that the idea of the gradual stages of the path that has various manifestations, such as the Lamrim and so on, that what it does is that it helps an individual to create a sense of preparedness. Preparedness meaning that, we human beings, we have all kinds of experiences. Some experiences we intend on, we plan for it. Other experiences occur as byproduct of some of these experiences, like, the experience, a desirable experience to succeed in life in some ways also has other kinds of byproducts that may not have all the juicy elements of success. Oftentimes it leads to sleep deprivation, anxiety, stress, and so on. Meaning, again, those are not necessarily desirable experiences, but they come as a byproduct of other sorts of seekings. And then there are experiences that are just haphazard, that we try to make sense of. It occurs to us, we experience it, and we try to make sense of those experiences. But then there's a notion of whether we were prepared to have a certain experience or not. Not so much as planning for an experience, but whether our mind is prepared to have certain kinds of experiences. And you would often hear people say, I'm surprised, wasn't expecting that, why did this happen, so on and so forth. That there are various ways in which we try to make sense of that experience, meaning that whether we are prepared for that experience or not doesn't sort of stop us from trying to make sense of those experiences or come up with stories around those things. So much of the practices around the gradual stages is for this sense of preparedness, meaning that what may happen to an individual in the process of meditative practices. And within these, there are different sort of framework of preparedness. One is a general sense of preparedness in terms of how to live a virtuous life. It's a general sense of preparedness, meaning that there are all kinds of push and pulls in this life, and one may get distracted, one may remain focused. But to have a general sense of guidelines of what one regards as a virtuous life. And virtuous life here, from Buddhist framing, is simply a lifestyle that is conducive to a spiritual well-being. It has no other connotation around it. It's not absolutely virtuous. It's virtuous in relationship to the fact that it is conducive to our spiritual well-being and supports sort of the spiritual lifestyle or the spiritual practices. The other kinds of preparedness is more, again, around sort of general terms of preparedness of experiences around obligations of this life, that we as human beings play a variety of roles in this life. One moment you're a son, next moment you're a brother, next moment you become a father, you become a mother, a sister, and so on. And again, it's a question of you observe other people going through these kinds of roles. You can imagine that someday you will be playing these roles, but whether one is prepared to do that or not. The number of times you have heard a young parent saying, I was never prepared to become a parent. That there was planning to become a parent, but they were never prepared to be a parent. And so there are these kinds of gaps that occur in terms of our experiences and sense of preparedness and so on. Awakening is, in terms of an experience, not an experience, but a set of experiences, is something along those lines, which is that we are never quite prepared for it. And that's why there's so much emphasis on the idea that be prepared. Because you can imagine, if you take even a simple example in your personal or professional life, when you have experienced a sense of disillusionment with things, you have given it 5 years, 10 years of your life, of your time, you have made a lot of effort, either towards a professional goal or towards a relationship or towards accumulating something in this life. And then you start to feel the sense of disillusionment, that this is what I was searching, spending all my effort, energy, and time, and trying to get to this thing. And maybe I'm there, maybe I'm partially there, but there's a sense of disillusionment that occurs. And again, oftentimes we are not prepared for that sense of disillusionment, the sense of disconnect with our goal, and so on. Even a tiny glimpse of awakening can cause a profound sense of disillusionment. Meaning, even a tiny glimpse into this awakened mind, on one degree, can cause a profound sense of disillusionment where you begin to question everything about everything. It's not just questions about life, it's questions about this world, it's questions about your place in it, what you have been doing, what do you plan to do, and so on. So even a tiny glimpse into that, can trigger that. But the other part of it is that even a tiny glimpse into awakening can make you experience or give you the experience of a profound sense of interconnectedness that you're not prepared for. A profound sense of interconnected, meaning that even a glimpse into a non-dual moment where you feel the sense of profound oneness with all things. You see, all our lives we have lived with this fragmented consciousness, with the feeling of being separate from all things. And we struggle to be one. We struggle to be one by virtue of being better communicators, trying to understand each other better, having empathy, trying to sort of recognize each other's emotional states and so on. Meaning that we try to gain proximity because we have all suffered some sort of separation because of this fragmented nature of this world and the fragmented consciousness that has sort of led us to these kinds of experiences. But this moment of awakening that gives us this profound sense of union with all things. And it's a delightful experience, but it's also a frightening experience. It's an overwhelming experience. We are not quite ready for it. So again, it's like people ask, what's the meaning of life? And the question is, are we prepared for it? Are we really truly ready for that. So even, and I'm not even talking about being in that experience. I'm talking about just a tiny glimpse of that awakening can lead to all such modalities in terms of how you're looking at the world, how you're looking at yourself. And that's why when awakening is haphazard meaning oftentimes awakening occurs when you're not thinking about it the most. I think some years ago, when I was in Kyoto with a few Zen friends, friends who are Zen monks, I would like to have Zen friends. Friends who were Zen monks. And we were talking about, awakening and sort of moments of awakening and so on. And, you kind of sort of, in certain Buddhist literature, you hear about awakening, but you hear it more in the sense that, they say, the practitioner was in the temple and suddenly had a moment of awakening. And then they describe things like, there were rainbows in the sky and there were all these auspicious signs and so on and so on. But there are far more mentions in Buddhist literature awakening happening when in the least expected spots. Most times, not even spots that were closer to a temple or something like that. Sometimes it'll be in a forest, sometimes it'll be in the outhouse, sometimes it's while somebody's gardening and so on. I mean, when you're doing your work, but when you're least expecting, you get a glimpse of something. And it freezes you. So it freezes you, meaning that you are so profoundly overwhelmed with your union to whatever you're doing. Like the example of a Zen teacher trying to cut flour and having that moment of awakening where he couldn't sense the separation between him and the scissors and the flour. Like it was all just a stream of continuity. And so he's just there holding the scissor for minutes, and until his students came and shook him a bit, and then he was like, okay, here I was cutting the flower. We have examples of, similar kinds of teachers, even in the Tibetan tradition. My favorite one is Togden Sakyashri, who was also a teacher of the previous Kune Rinpoche, very prominent Dzogchen yogi. And some days he would go to the outhouse in the morning, like most people do, and he would just never come out. Because if you remember, outhouses in Tibet and Mongolia are the most scenic spots you can imagine. They're outdoors and they're in the mountains, they're in the valley and so on. And so he would go, to do his morning business, and he would just bliss out. He would just sort of gaze at the sky and he's gone. And then his students would have to sort of look for him after a few hours, come and pick him up, and So it wasn't like you were planning that, I'm going to sit in meditation in the temple and then sort of go into that kind of state. So this particular kind of awakening happens. And then the challenge is sort of, how to emerge from it, how to sort of make sense of it and so on. So the sense of preparedness vis-a-vis bodhicitta is that to the best of our ability to shape our mind, to nurture our mind in a manner that it handles these experiences of awakening, these moments of realizations, insights, in a way that it doesn't lead to a negative sense of disillusionment, meaning that disillusionment is just disillusionment, right? And then you create an added layer of it, meaning in which direction you sort of operate it. And the idea that that kind of disillusionment could actually become a motivation and can serve as a momentum factor or driver for your practice of renunciation, for your practice of commitment to dharma and so on. But on the other hand, there are such moments which render people incapable. They become lunatics and so on. When I was young, my family members can tell you how many times I used to run away from home. And
Still young.
I was still young. And during one of these excursions, I just took off to Vrindavan and spent a few days in Vrindavan and at the no-name ashram. And then, every morning I would go out and I was with this wonderful yogi. And I would take morning walks with him and he would, greet these people on the street who were visibly lunatics, meaning that they were smeared in dirt, but not like sadhus. I had seen sadhus. They were just, people that you might find in ISBT or railway stations begging or, with sort of some silly hairdo and things like that. And this yogi, a friend, he would sort of stop, greet them, ask them how they are and so on. And they would respond very politely. And then they would go again into sort of this weird kind of act of things. And so after like few days of doing this, I asked him and I said, Baba, why is it that you're stopping and talking to them while other people are just ridiculing them? Some are giving them food, but most of them just, if you look at them, they look like just, people suffering from intense states of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or something of that nature. And he said something very interesting. He said, no, they're all bhakts. They're all bhakts. They're all devotees. Some of them were just not ready for the experience. That some of them were just not ready for the experience. And it short-circuited the brain in such a manner that now they can't make sense of most things. So there are moments in the day when they are all sort of into the experience, and otherwise they are sort of to the outside, or a lunatic, just doing random things. So on. And the analogy in the Buddhist world, oftentimes that's given is almost like, if you take a glass, there's a regular glass made of glass, and you pour very hot fluid in it, it shatters, it cracks. And oftentimes that's the analogy that is used, that if the mind is not prepared, then the practitioner shatters, meaning that you have these awakening experiences, and you're not a proper vessel to hold that experience, let alone transmit that experience later on to somebody else. But you're not even able to make sense of it or hold it. So as much as we desire awakening, as much as we want awakening, it's a crucial thing as a practitioner to pay attention to the fact whether we are prepared for it. And therefore, much of Buddhist literature, the practice elements, focus on that sense of preparedness, to be prepared to do this. And even the cultivation of 6 perfections in terms of a bodhisattva's way of life, those are all elements that add to that sense of preparedness, the sense of patience, the sense of meditation, the practice of virya, and so on. That there are all various elements that allows a practitioner to create this sense of preparedness. When one is focused, even in the vast sort of spectrum of training, if one is simply focused on this idea of 4 immeasurables and the cultivation of 6 perfections, and there's no better work than Shantideva's Bodhicharya avatar to look at the cultivation of 6 perfections and so on. That creates this preparedness of our mind to go through this kind of process of self-transformation where we can look at it in terms of an awakened mind, in terms of bodhicitta and so on. So if you read traditional literature and so on, oftentimes they mention that there are 2 stages to bodhicitta. One is the generation stage and one is sort of the ultimate stage or actualization stage of sorts. Then within the generation stage of bodhicitta, so Shantideva in chapter 3, he refers to the distinction of bodhi pranidhi chitta and bodhi prasthana chitta. So pranidhi chitta, meaning that at that moment, an individual is simply reflecting. And that sense of reflection in itself becomes a sense of preparedness, meaning, why is it that I'm not content with my mind at this state, in this particular stage in my life? So you're looking at some of the aspirational elements of what this bodhicitta can do, what this awakened mind can do, meaning that, it's not just the sound of an awakened or altruistic mind that is attractive to an individual. It's the content. What is this content of altruism? Or what is this content of awakening? How would it be different from the current state of mind? So next thing in this factor of awakening is that an individual begins to think of, well, if I want to even begin exploring this process of transformation, to even sort of have this sense of awakening, this glimpse of awakening. And at this moment, I'm simply referring to it as a glimpse because it's again your sense of preparedness that allows you to reflect on your capability and capacity to sustain that glimpse, to sustain that glimpse of awakening so that you can be in that state for a prolonged period of time. Otherwise, it's just, it's too hot to handle this state. So when you're contemplating and reflecting, and as Shantideva does it brilliantly, he begins by focusing on the idea of how is this mind going to be different from this current state. And he says, well, one, that in your recognition of things being interdependent and things being interconnected, one thing you recognize is that we are all trying to overcome suffering to some degree. And even this conversation with animal behavior scientists, this was one of the interesting things, which was that even the most basic notion of evolutionary consciousness is not that the animals are seeking pleasure, but animals are trying to escape suffering. And that's one thing that connects us in this sort of, interspecies world that we are in, that we're all trying to escape suffering to some degree. Who creates that suffering? What creates the suffering is of secondary nature at the moment. But that we are all intent on moving ourselves from this state of suffering. But what Bodhichitta allows us to do is to make us recognize that it need not be a solitary practice, that it need not be a solo job. That although it is my suffering, and the wonderful thing about pleasure or pain is that it's an entirely personal experience. Others may be affected by it, but nobody can experience your pain and pleasure in a manner that you do. However, when we are talking about alleviation of suffering, then what the generation stage of Bodhichitta allows us to do is that it gives us some degree of clarity over understanding the nature of suffering, what the system of suffering is. And having some clarity in that nature of suffering, about the nature of suffering, we are able to sort of then look at ways in which we can slowly begin to lessen that suffering. In the beginning, not even complete eradication of it, but simply the process of lessening. Again, there could be sudden moments where you completely eradicate suffering. But even in the process of lessening it, it creates a kind of reinforcement that your mind is capable of thinking beyond yourself. That your mind is capable of thinking beyond yourself because we have all heard the evolutionary argument around self-cherishment and things of that nature. But humans are more complex than that. And so the idea that even the generation stage of Bodhichitta allows us to step away, even temporarily, from this sense of self, from the sense of self-cherishment. And from Mahayana and Vajrayana perspective, that's sort of a very important element because you see, it's one thing for an individual to say, I'm miserable and I wish to become free of this misery that I wish to sort of completely get rid of. And then somebody tells you, well, this is the path and you should go about it. And as most of you know, probably from your personal experience, that human beings are highly inconsistent creatures. Meaning that even if we know that something is going to free us or alleviate us from suffering, we look at that practice through the lens of our mood swings. Today I feel like practicing. Today I don't feel like practicing. Today I feel like only giving this much time to it, and so on. Meaning that we are not very consistent or disciplined when it comes to commitment to practice and so on. Meaning the practice, for the most part, in our hierarchy of prioritization or priorities that we do, seldom it makes to the top 5 things. And even if it makes to the top 5 things, your top 3 are so important that you never get to the 5th priority in your life. And that's how we rationalize, our day-to-day sort of engagement with things that we do. So having this moment, even in the generation stage, to move away temporarily from this sense of self-cherishment, recognizing that I don't need to do this all by myself. In some ways, I'm the one making the effort, but I don't need to make this effort just for me. Remember, I don't know how many of you are into cooking and so on, but when you cook and you're just cooking for yourself, you get lazy. It's too laborious of a job to cook for one person. So you eat all the crap that's in the kitchen because cooking is just too laborious. But then you're inviting a couple of friends and you like to cook. So you're having like 5 friends or 10 friends over. It energizes you. It becomes sort of an exciting thing to do. And you're like, well, I want to cook for 10 people. And they're coming over and this is exciting. I'm enjoying this process. Depends which 10 people are there, but at least the process becomes exciting to somebody. And in early stages of meditation, this kind of methodology is very important in terms of generation stage, which is that sometimes when you practice on your own, for your own sake, it's just like that. It's like inconsistent. I can only do 10 minutes, although it's recommended I do 40 and so on. But the consistency is not there because the joy is not there. But when you have this early cultivation of bodhicitta and you say, no, I'm doing this for a bunch of my friends. You're not even thinking about all sentient beings at the moment. You're doing this so that your friends, people you care about, can have a better understanding of their life and their practice and so on. So in your mind, you're saying, I'm doing it for them. So it's basically sort of engaging in the process of joyful cooking. The practice becomes joyful because now you're not just doing it for yourself, you're doing it for others. And in the Buddhist tradition, the dedication of merit is that precise process, which is you invite others to partake in your practice. That's the dedication of merit. So it's a beautiful sort of process by which you experience what it is to practice just for self versus the practice when you are focused on the benefit of others. And slowly you expand this capacity. You expand this capacity, and as you build on your equanimity, as we discussed last time, as you build on your equanimity and your sense of compassion becomes more pervasive and becomes more untethered, unbiased, where you have lost, in a good way, you have lost the sense of that this person is more dear to me to the other because of the transactions that you have had. But to say that no, each one of them is worthy of partaking in the benefits of this practice. And as the capacity grows, as the breadth of who you're benefiting grows in your mind, the more stable this generation stage of bodhicitta becomes. Because now, this stage of bodhicitta, it's only fueled by your sense of kindness. It's only fueled by your sense of compassion towards all things. But as you are spending more and more time
You see, in this state, it gives you other kinds of insights, meaning that it reinforces, again, some of these insights around what does it mean to be an individual versus what does it mean to be a collective? What is interdependence? So then things that you have been reading about, interdependence, interconnectedness, and various expressions of that, that you have understood in principle, intellectually, because all of you are bright individuals, and you have understood how the process actually works. But in this generation stage, after a while, it's a visceral feeling. It's a visceral feeling, meaning that you actually begin to have a deeper sense of it. So now when somebody says interconnectedness or interdependence, you're not racking your brain to go through certain kind of inferential steps to say, because this is dependent on that and that causes that, that's why. No. You have a protection. You see, you have this kind of a very visceral experience of it. And that in itself sort of brings you to experience this beautiful state of being connected with all things. There is no separation anxiety. There is no sort of sense of who I am in a manner that, of whether people see me or not. But you feel this beauty of being connected with things in a manner that again reinforces your practice. That my practice should never be bereft of my concern for other sentient beings. Chandrakirti, in one of his writings, he's discussing the causes for enlightenment, and he thanks sentient beings. He says sentient beings are the cause of my enlightenment. People sort of attribute various things, in this process of causation, of what causes awakening, what causes, this highest form of enlightenment, and so on. And Chandrakirti says that it is the sentient beings that are the cause of enlightenment. And why? Because if it wasn't for them, my practice won't be stable. And if it wasn't for them, I wouldn't even begin to venture into great compassion. Meaning, and you have heard this probably before, but it's important to recognize that the Buddhists are not just encouraging you to be kind and compassionate. They're trying to actually tell you to get out of your narrative of what it means to be kind and compassionate. Meaning that to be kind and compassionate to people that you like is not particularly Buddhist. Everybody can do that. There's no cultivation in that. You're wired to do that. Some have better wiring than others because of certain experiences are better than others, and that reinforces. The enterprise of Buddhism, when they talk about Mahakaruna, Mahakaruna is not just the capacity for great compassion. The greatness in Mahakaruna is that it's completely free, it's unbiased. It doesn't regard things like, what am I going to get out of this person? Or whether this person is related to me or not. Meaning that it's sort of completely unbiased, equal, looking at all things sentient with that sense of compassionate eyes that Avalokiteshvara is sort of exemplary figure of. So that's the greatness and great compassion, and that's something that we need to sort of constantly reflect on. That it's not just as I think I mentioned it earlier too, that we're all familiar with acts of kindness. We engage in day in and day out, and we even recognize acts of kindness, and we say, yeah, today I acted in a kind way, tomorrow I'll act in a kind way. We have these kinds of intent. But the generation state of Bodhichitta, it's creating this mindset, which is that your mind is moistened with compassion, meaning that you're not looking for particular acts of kindness. You're transforming your mind in a manner that every act, every thought, every speech that emerges out of that mind is kind in nature. That's the beauty of this a mind, karuna snigdha manasa, a mind that is moistened with compassion. It's not looking for occasional acts. In your preliminary studies, somebody would tell you to do kind act or engage in kind act. Why? Because that's the way we make sense of things. We get into this sense of looking at, well, I have been doing unkind acts and maybe I'll do 5 kind acts and so on. Even in old days, the Kadam masters, when they were training, they would do these kinds of things. The Kadam masters in their caves, they will have like a piece of charcoal and a piece of limestone, and then they're meditating all day. But they're also observing their mind. And if there was one non-virtuous thought, they'll take a charcoal, strike a line. And then if it was a virtuous thing, then they will strike a line. And then at the end of the day, they will count, how many black lines versus white lines. And all it did was that it created the sense of vigilance. They were not interested in quantifying how many kind or unkind thoughts they're having. All it did was created the sense of vigilance, that they were able to say that despite of these, commitment to practice, these are the negative things that can arise. And therefore, the intent to transform the mind in a manner that its very nature is compassion, that its very nature is such that only kind things come out of it. That would be a leap in our evolutionary cycle. I mean, imagine a mind where we don't have to deal with inefficiencies of constantly trying to judge virtuous and non-virtuous actions. That you recognize that everything that comes out of it is virtuous. How much time and energy it would save us. But that's the kind of, practice in the generation stage of bodhicitta that you're trying to get to. I mean, holding bodhicitta, being vigilant about it, and so on. Then within bodhi praniti citta, then the next step is bodhi prasthana citta in the generation, which is that now that you have thought about it, that you have reflected on these things, the next thing is to act on it. Why act on it? Because again, we are creatures of habit. It's a reinforcement mechanism in early stages. And if you don't act on it, it's not going to go anywhere. Now, what do I mean by that? That we humans, we sometimes become overtly self-congratulatory just for having a kind thought. You're flying, you have a very nice seat right up in the front. Maybe you paid extra or you got lucky, you got upgraded, and there you are. And you're sitting and you're thinking about this long flight that's ahead of you. It's a great seat. And then suddenly you see an elderly person walk you by. And you look at their boarding pass and you know that this person is seated 30 rows behind. And you're like, oh, I wish this person had a better seat. Then you're like, well, what's preventing from this person to have a better seat? I could make an offer and say, would you like to sit here? If it's a very long flight, we could say, well, maybe for an hour you sit here, for an hour I'll sit there, and then we'll change back and forth. Flight attendants don't like that. I can tell you that from experience. But at least in your mind, you're saying that let's try to alleviate some suffering of this individual by this process. But sometimes what happens is we just, rather than going through the action of it, we just say, I'm such a kind person. I had that thought. It's so wonderful that I actually thought about offering my seat to that person. And then you're beaming with smile for the rest of your flight. Because that one kind thought, has just energized you for your entire flight. And that's where the trap is in terms of even the first stage of bodhi praniti citta, which is that the idea is to habituate the mind with bodhi, with this awakened altruistic state. Right? It is not to get trapped in. not trapped in it, meaning that there has to be then the Bodhiprasthana. What is it that you can manifest? What is it that you can manifest now that you have started to contemplate these sorts of things? And that's where, you see, again, in terms of the manifestation aspect of Bodhicitta, it doesn't need to be something great. See, it doesn't need to be something that needs to be great in scale or size or magnitude, value, and so on. But that it needs to be good, that it needs to be coming out of a place of right intention and put into practice. It's not about, sometimes you get into this mode of thinking that I'll only engage in this act if this act is really, really big. That if this act is really, really big. Now, one of the things that Mother Teresa used to say, said that we cannot all do great acts. We cannot all engage in great acts. But we can all engage in acts with great kindness. That even if it's a tiny act, informed by Bodhicitta, it's a valuable act. So one should not get into this comparative mindset of whether this act is as good. And that's where the incremental sense of practice comes in. That you work in a manner that as you're embarking on manifesting Bodhicitta, that on a daily basis, if possible, on a daily basis, trying to do some activity. And that activity could even be an act of speech. How many people am I encouraging today? How many people am I encouraging with the kindness or gentleness of speech? How many people do I scare versus give them a sense of fearlessness, imparting that sense of fearlessness? How many people get a sense of caring, that just by virtue of how you speak to them, that they feel cared for? Even those tiny acts of speech can help stabilize this generation state of Bodhicitta. And then you start sort of looking into sharing of resources and things of that nature. And that again sort of helps structure that sense of generation of Bodhicitta. When are we supposed to?
Whenever you want.
She is Lama Zuba student. So when we speak of cultivation of Bodhicitta, I think initially in preliminary practices, individuals should simply focus on the Bodhi Pranidhi and Bodhi Prasthana Chitta, these two formats. Within Bodhi Pranidhi and Bodhi Prasthana, the third component that comes in is something that I was discussing with folks upstairs when I came in, is this aspect of integration. Integration meaning that we have difficulty integrating many aspects of our life. We might think one thing, we do another thing, we do another thing, we might think something else. And so in some ways we become very proficient in it. So we become very proficient in it, and compartmentalization becomes our second nature. We simply give into this idea that life is complex as it is. We need to just compartmentalize what our intent is versus how we behave, how we live, and so on and so on. And as I mentioned earlier, that one of the beauty of Bodhicitta at the cultivation stage is that it allows you to look at various aspects of such fragmentations, various aspects of what is causing this fragmentation. So that's the insight that comes with this practice. When you're able to do that, then you're able to gain certain kinds of insights into how is it that you're spending your time and resources. And it's an act of prioritization and reprioritization, meaning that your practice is not something that should be an added layer into rest of your life. And what I mean by added layer is that it's not that you live your life and then once in a while you go for a satsang or visit a temple and things of that nature. To say to yourself that I also do that. This is how I live my life, but I am also religious. This is how I live day in and day out, but I also go to temples. That's the biggest form of compartmentalization that we live in, which is to tell ourselves that spiritual life is an add-on to everything else that we are doing. If cultivation of bodhicitta can teach us anything, which is that this transformative state is something where spiritual life and spiritual priorities become the thread through and through all priorities that you have for yourself. Meaning that it's no longer an added layer to something else, but it becomes the ground through which you begin to think and act and manifest how it is that you want to live your life. That's a life of bodhicitta. Easier said than done, meaning that it does require, there are many kinds of elements of bodhicitta, if you look at it. And one thing that I just want to touch on is, if you read like Maitreya's text on Buddha nature. And there's this beautiful thing there. It says that, Buddha said that everybody has the potential to become a Buddha, that we are all actually united in that matter, that you all have clear light, you all have Buddha nature. But why is it that we are not recognizing it? Why is it that it's not only that I don't recognize my own Buddha nature, I'm not recognizing yours either. And he says that the first obstacle to Buddha nature is fear, faint-heartedness, to be precise. It's not a full-blown fear that I'll become a Buddha, or that you might be a Buddha, or that I might discover something new. It's faint-heartedness. It's this borderline of reluctance and fear, which is more dangerous than a full-blown fear. Because it just lingers. You know that state of mind when you want to do something and you have been thinking about doing it for 5 years, 10 years go by. It's not a full-blown state of fear. It's just hesitation. I've been thinking about it. I've been reflecting. It's been 5 years. I'm still reflecting. But there's just this reluctance, this hesitation. That what might happen if I do this? But I have gone through my head a number of times calculating what might happen. But nonetheless, I don't want to dive into that. Why? Because there's still this hesitation. There may be some variables that I'm still missing in my calculations. That's the first and the foremost obstacle in Buddha nature, in the recognition of Buddha nature. And that's where we see even the first obstacle in generation of bodhicitta. And even taking this leap from pranidhi to prasthana, from holding to manifesting bodhicitta, this reluctance. So the first thing that a practitioner should look at, it's not to look at full-blown cause in terms of the root causes of fear, but even to look at this lingering notion of fear, this faint-heartedness, sense of reluctance, saying, why? I mean, I know it's there. It's been there for a while, but why? And your brilliant brain is going to give you all kinds of rationalizations. You go back into state of calm abiding and look at it, say, is that really so? Meaning, do I really believe all my rationalizations around this thing? Because, we are the best consumers of our own stories. We're great storytellers, and we are dedicated consumers of them. So you have to ask yourself, is this really so? And so it's not like, this thing will go away overnight, but it shouldn't linger on for another 6 months. Because it has already lingered on. You're familiar with that state. Recognizing that, and then sort of bringing again insights of cultivation of Bodhichitta and saying, now beginning to look at it, well, for as long as I remember, this was an add-on to everything that I was doing, unless you took a vow of a religious life or something, it's an add-on. Even if you have taken a religious vow, there are different notions of why you took a religious vow, and so the reflection is then useful. And so that insight, that reflection process will then allow it to become the ground. And then you start to enact this prioritization aspect of it. And it works even with as simple things as, how much should I meditate? This is the biggest sort of bluff that I hear these days, people saying 20 minutes of meditation and 30 minutes of meditation, like trying to standardize a time that would be good for you. Yes, it's an encouragement, to say that, oh, meditate 20 minutes or 30 minutes or whatever. But think of it in this way. If you ask the physician how much you should exercise, how much cardio you should do, how much you should run, how much you should exercise, the first thing the physician is going to look at is your diet. He's going to say, well, how many calories are you consuming? Meaning that as an individual, you cannot say to yourself that, well, I consume 500 calories a day and I do 20 minutes of workout. And it should be the same even if I'm consuming 2,500 calories a day. The 20 minutes of workout will be beneficial. It's just the math doesn't add up. And the same thing is with early stages of meditation. 20 minutes gets you on a ramp. It familiarizes you. But it's all a function of how much toxicity is there, how much you need to work on. So if we are going to immerse ourselves in a toxic environment for most part of our day, and by toxic, I mean, a mind that is exposed and that engages in, for pretty much all kinds of negative thinking or negative emotional patterns. And then to tell yourself 20 minutes of meditation will solve that issue. That's not going to happen. At best, it will lead you to another kind of disillusion, which is meditation doesn't work. You'll be frustrated. Like, I've been meditating for 10 years. For how long? 20 minutes a day. Yes, it'll bring about some benefit, but it's all a function of what it is that you're consuming. What is it that your mind is dwelling in? When you start with focus on bodhicitta, a lot of these issues that come up, it's not that you're listening just from outside, but all of these issues that come up, you sort of are able to reflect on it with a very calm mind. And most beautiful gift of it is that you're reflecting on it, but it's not that you're judging yourself all the time. Meaning you truly sort of recognize even the value of self-compassion. Self-compassion in the sense that it's not to become pitiful about yourself. It's not self-pity. But self-compassion in the sense that I'm going to build up. I'm going to engage in this process of capacity building. And I'm going to do it at a pace with tremendous virya, with this tremendous sense of joyful energy and joyful effort. But it won't happen overnight. I know that as well. And I'm not going to push myself to the point where I'll shatter, where I'll break. But that's sort of the best model, that it gives you this kind of feedback that this is what ought to happen next, and this is what ought to happen next, and so on. And that's how you build your. And then, having become somewhat proficient, not perfect. Perfect is the enemy of good. For those of you who seek perfection. Only perfection you should seek is the perfection of paramitas. Besides that, all of the perfections are overrated. But when you have become proficient in this generation stage, meaning that that is a consideration in your life day in and day out, then slowly you begin to start getting a glimpse. And by glimpse, I mean just that you begin to see the path for ultimate bodhicitta. So maybe I'll pause there. Then, sure.
Yeah, we can take some questions now. Maybe we can alternate. Sorry, I'm still processing so much.
No worries.
We can alternate with questions in person and on Zoom. So we can start with a question in person.
Yeah.
And if you can use the mic, please, for those so that those on Zoom can hear you. Yeah. Mind standing.
Well, would you suggest focusing on one particular aspect that one is trying to improve on, versus focusing on everything that one does in a day or habitually, which is a good practice or an easier one to engage in for better success?
I mean, of course, starting with one aspect is useful, but you have to see whether you're experiencing some degree of transformation in that one particular point after a couple of weeks or not, or even a couple of months. If not, then it's better to take up another challenge and then come back to it after that.
That would suggest that you take a more harder thing to do.
No, it simply means that sometimes your mind is dwelling so much on solving something that you get frustrated when you don't see any improvement. So then it's useful to focus on something else for a period of time. That might give you insight about the first thing. And that's helpful. You know, it happens even to many meditators. There was a time, I remember, a meditator in Dharamshala, he was meditating on impermanence because His Holiness had asked him as a practice, and he got really depressed after a few weeks of practice impermanence, and he got so depressed that it just took the energy out of his practice. It couldn't make sense of things. Now, rationally, all his insights were good. They were rational. It was all about impermanence. But he couldn't emotionally connect with those insights in certain moment. So he came to his teacher for advice, and the teacher listened to it and said, enough. Don't meditate on impermanence. Which again sounds like a, out of normal thing for a Buddhist teacher to stop meditating on impermanence. But he recognized that at that moment, it wasn't doing much good to his mind. So switching the object of meditation at that time to something else.
Distractions or?
No, it's not a distraction. It's just it's widening the view in some way. So the tradition has those kinds of norms, right? Like, even simple things like, a form of shamatha is ekagricitta. We're looking at one-pointed concentration. Another form of shamatha could be expansive mind, where you're not focused on one thing, but just observing all things. Or another manifestation of it is like sky gazing, or the kashinas in the Pali text, looking at the ground, at the water, and so on. Meaning that sometimes you have to oscillate between different kinds of practices to get the mind in the right place.
One more question. In a state of overwhelm that happens because of certain insight that one gets. One thing is that you focus more and more on it, and then over a period of time, that overwhelm kind of reduces
but then it takes sometimes hours, sometimes days. Is there anything that you would suggest to cut down on it?
See, one of the things that I'm always reminded from a dear friend of mine, Thomas Keating, the Benedictine monk, is when you venture into any kind of contemplative practice, one of the first things that you should let go of is having an experience on your terms. It's truly free. But it's not that we human beings are capable of having realizations and recognitions, enlightenment even, but to have it on our terms, for whatever reason, to have it on our terms, that's a blockage, that's an obstacle. So you have an insight. If it overwhelms you, you stay still. You stay still in the sense you simply observe. And you see what happens next.
There's a question on Zoom.
I don't see a question. Are they texting or no? I see hands raised. Okay. All right.
Thank you, Venerable. I just wanted to ask, when you said, it was strange that you said looking at recognizing Buddha nature in ourselves and others, it's because of faint-heartedness. For me, it's like just an intellectual idea that we have. Everybody gives you this comparison of water being pure and everything is dirt and it can be removed, and the basic nature is pure. But that's an intellectual idea. So I say, yes, I'm sure that I have Buddha nature. I just have a lot of cleaning to do. I don't think I actually believe that. But you said something else. You said that we are faint-hearted about recognizing Buddha nature in ourselves and others. What would I be scared of? Like, what would be the fear of trying to recognize it in myself or others?
Not being yourself.
Sorry?
Not being the person. Not being yourself. Not the person who's asking this question.
That is something to think about. Thank you. Yes. I never thought of that actually. Yes.
Yeah.
Venerable, so like Lama Rupa and Pucha also used to say, I think I've read in one of his teachings that determination is a major thing that can be useful in Dharma practice. That one makes determination in the morning that I'm not going to engage in certain negative emotions. But I struggle sometimes between determination and force being applied to remove particular things. Like determination almost instantly for me leads to like, oh, I don't want this emotional state in my mind and I need to forcefully remove it. But I also don't think force is particularly encouraged.
No, I think those are two different models. Determination is one thing. But with regard to emotions, if we are simply talking about emotions, what you're referring to is suppression of emotions, or you're referring to sort of suppression of emotion by overlaying another emotion on top of that. That's not determination. That's just suppression and overlaying of things. Determination there would imply the determination to look at why this particular emotion state, meaning why is the mind at this moment in time choosing to dwell in that emotional state. Determination would imply application of antidotes that if you have come to the necessary conclusion that this is not a desirable emotional state, that you don't want it anymore, then if it's not a desirable emotional state, it's not that you're trying to suppress it. You're trying to tell yourself, well, what's an antidote to it? What is it that I could replace? Because human mind does not operate in vacuum. It'll have some emotional state until you are at a certain degree of a meditative state. So then it's a question of, well, if I'm going to displace this emotional state, not suppress it, displace it, and it happens methodically, what's the antidote that I can have? And the Buddhist texts give you a whole range of antidotes for that. So determination, there is application of antidotes, not the suppression of emotions.
This is basically like what we do in shamatha, is to let go of that negative emotional state and focus the mind on. In shamatha is breath, but let's say for application of antidote is some others.
No. It's not shamatha. If you're talking with regard to emotional states, shamatha in that moment is simply an observation. So you're calmly observing. You're calmly observing because if you're in that emotional state, most negative emotional state either gives you a feeling of dullness or agitation. You cannot do shamatha in either of those states. So shamatha is withdrawing from that agitation or dullness in some ways. And then you apply vipassana, you apply analysis of those emotional states. Upon applying analysis, simple things like, what is jealousy? Who's jealous? Where am I feeling it? Where do I feel this body? When was the last time I? So you're asking a series of questions, but you are not simply repeating your responses. So one day you get one set of responses. Next day, if you get the same set of responses, you say, been through that. Anything new? So now you are looking at exhausting the rational response to those kinds of things. You're still getting an understanding of what it is, but you're not clinging to any single response. In that process, if the mind gets agitated or dull, you go back again into this alert aspect of shamatha. Once a calm abiding is achieved, you re-engage with the process. When we have gotten to your point after analysis, not because somebody told you anger is bad for you, but upon analysis, when you have said, okay, this is a non-desirable emotion, then you say, well, what's the antidote? Then you start with the process of application of antidote. But it's not just happening in your head. You're creating also behaviors of disruption during that, which is in your analysis, you will have these insights that these are the times of the day when you experience this emotional state the most. You become vigilant during those times of the day. And you say, I'm about to experience these states. Can I apply the antidote? So even simple things like, I know when I go to my office or my workplace, I have this one individual who tests my patience. And chances are he'll come at 10:30 and I'll be agitated. And for last few years, what I've been doing is I just tell him, I don't want to hang out with you. You are annoying me and this, that, and the other. Today, this person comes and I look him in the eyes and I say, how's your day going? Is it? Now, you may not be genuinely concerned about how his day is going. Is it? But what you're doing is you're disrupting the signal of your habitual behavior towards this person by introducing an antidote, which is a sense of care. So all that needs to come together. So you see, there's no suppression that's happening anymore, but it's all determination.
Thank you, Venerable. I really found your talk today very useful. I think it'll take time for me to really soak in whatever you have, the breadth of what you have said. But my question is a very limited, narrow focus today, but it's also for me to request how you think about a particular problem so that I might benefit from it. This is related to diets. Avoiding meat in diet, I have always considered tied to one's upasaka of not killing. But the more I read in the last couple of years of plants having sentience, that's I'm not sure how to practically think about it, because you have in the last 15 years, increasingly you see this scientific evidence coming out of plants having increasing different levels of sentience, communication, and so emotions and so on. And in Buddhist theology, classically, traditionally, when you think about it, you only hear about sentient still animals. So this is a bit confusing for me, and I've been thinking about it. And the fact that you tangentially mentioned about the conferences you had gone to made me think that it could be of help to just hear what you think about this. Thank you.
I'm not going to solve the problem for you today, but if you're simply going based on scientific data, the consensus in the scientific community up until yesterday is plants are not sentient. And there are a variety of sort of arguments around that, which we need not go into. They may exhibit or mimic, they may even have certain chemical compositions, and we may challenge the speculation that if an organism doesn't have a central nervous system, does it stop being sentient? But there are different kinds of arguments on that. But as of yesterday, I can tell you this, that plants have no sentience. We'll continue to explore on that. And with regards to animal and so on, you have to understand something. You see, nature is amoral. Morality is a purely human construct. That human construct allows us to create some form of order in society. In seeking that form of order in society, we come up with ethical guidelines that allows us to become better practitioners. But becoming better practitioners does not mean that we obey all orders. When you become a good practitioner of Buddha Dharma, you don't obey social orders. You're challenging different kinds of orders. So when it comes to notions of sentience, but looking at it from the point of view of morality to consider diet and things of that nature, those things require a bit more thinking. You see, a bit more thinking in the sense that, for example, I always knew this, but I always knew one part of this information. But I discovered yesterday that in experimental research on animals, the first so-called very humane considerations were drafted in 1936 of how animals should be treated during experimental research in 1936. You look at that manifesto of how animals should be treated, it's remarkable. Do you know who drafted it? The Nazis. Do you know who was the signer on it? Hitler. And you know what Hitler was? A vegetarian. Now, the question is this: how could he have such a humane manifesto about treatment of animals, but treat humans in the way he did? And the reason I'm bringing up this extreme example is simply because that it needs to be thought through a bit more. That it shouldn't just be, a polarized idea that, that this diet or this kind of practice is going to be suitable for things. That's why always be mindful that Buddha never took a stance on this. Now, what I'm not endorsing is the idea of raising animals just for the sake of killing them. Because what we are also recognizing is as society gets affluent, meat eating increases. And because meat eating increases, we have created a factory of farm animals, which has very, it's a travesty, the kind of condition that happens there. But those are the things that we need to think about in order to regulate the social order. But there's nothing implicit in this. And that's what we need to think about, that if we left everything in nature, everybody's food. There's no moral construct around that.
Any other questions?
Ask me something easy for a change.
So if we take these experiences that kind of mess us up in a sense, these sudden awakenings or sudden, I don't know. So is it good if we stay in that experience for like a longer period of time? Because sometimes we have the opportunity to come out. So is it better to stay or is it better to come out?
It's a function of how you are in that state, right? Like, so if you're in that state and the state is sustained, see, without necessarily being taxing on you for some reason, then it's fine to stay and familiarize yourself with that state. But sometimes, most times, let me put it this way, there's a distinction between sustaining of a state and recreation of a state, even in a single session, even in a single segment of thing. Here's a distinction. I experience something and I stay in that state, that's fine. I experience something. I recognize that I'm experiencing something. I assert and affirm that I'm experiencing something. And then I decide to stay in that experience, is a recreation of that experience. You understand that?
Wow. And so what would be the practices to prepare us to not to have such a like a messing up experience, but more like an awakening experience?
All experiences mess you up.
Yeah.
It's a question of whether you regard a good messing up or a negative messing up. If it doesn't mess you up, it's not an experience. It doesn't change you. But the reason for the path, the reason for the gradual path, why practices around Lamrim and such are valuable, because they create a scaffolding. They create a scaffolding that allows you to stay within certain parameters. And that adds both a sense of support and a sense of structure. This parameter, so that you can avoid the pitfalls, so to speak, of certain haphazard kinds of things.
So you would suggest to follow the Lamrim meditations and then
I would say, no. There are several kinds of Lamrims. Every Buddhist tradition in Tibet has a Lamrim or some version of it. What I would suggest is familiarize yourself with Lamrim. And certain methods and processes may apply to you, because what Lamrim was is a generalized version of the structure. But remember, Buddhism is not one size fits all. So certain aspects of Lamrim will fit you better than others, but that requires engagement with Lamrim. So familiarization with the entire process is useful, but you will see that some things impact you more than others within that.
Can you take a last question from Leon Zoom to ship their own copy of the book to us here to get it signed by
Is there a name?
Ranjan?
Ranjan? Ranjani? Okay.
Pranam, good evening, Venerable. My takeaway from your talk today is engaging in capacity building. This is very, very useful for me. My question is, you spoke about bhakts becoming insane or becoming lunatics. My question is, how does a glimpse of awakening occur to a practitioner who is not yet prepared?
Who's not yet prepared or is prepared?
Not yet.
Who's not yet prepared?
Not yet. Yeah, not yet.
Not yet prepared. I mean, the glimpse can happen in variety of forms. When one is not prepared, the first thing is one doesn't recognize that glimpse, even if it's happening a fair amount. Or if they recognize the glimpse, and as I mentioned earlier, that it leads to a certain sense of disillusionment, meaning that the only way to get out of it is to deny that experience and say that never occurred. So I'm going to go back to my old ways of doing it. Because as long as one is aware that it occurred, maybe the world around them doesn't make sense as it did before. So those are sort of, some of the examples. And we are all prone to certain kinds of glimpses, but it's just a matter of how aware we are to them, and then what we do beyond that. Sometimes getting a glimpse is not hard work. Preparedness is hard work. That's where the practice part also comes in. Sure. Why not?
Hi, Venerable. Thank you for the wonderful teaching. I wanted to ask, following on that question you just answered, this profound sense of disillusionment that you talked about, how does that relate to this sense of interconnectedness that you pointed out to? Could you elaborate on that a little bit more, please?
First thing is all analogies have limitations. The disillusionment that is happening there is primarily that if you are simply familiar with this idea of separation, that I'm an individual, I'm a separate being, I'm unique in a different way of being unique that allows more separation between the self and the other and so on. So when you have a deeper experience of interconnectedness, that's disillusionment because it shatters all your existing framework. You're no longer unique in the way you think you are. You're no longer separated from the things that you think you are. So again, you can deny that experience and say, I had never had it. Or you get the glimpse of it and say, how do I make sense of this? Because it challenges all the existing presumptions that I had about myself. And that could be also a form of disillusion.
Thank you.
Please go ahead, whoever has their hand up.
Yeah, I'm Charu. I have my hand up. I wanted to ask you about something that happened today. I was taking a little walk, and then I looked at these flowers. I needed to change the flowers in a flower bed. And I looked at the flowers. There were a few of them which were still blooming. And I suddenly, I don't know whether it was a moment or it was not a moment, but for a moment I sort of felt that the flowers that were blooming, I felt very sad that I have to remove them. And I also felt like as though they were my children, or they were coming from me. And I just felt the sense of sadness that I'm asking for those flowers to be removed in the bed. And then I couldn't do it. I just couldn't bring myself to do it. So I told the gardener that don't take those flowers off. So I want to know, was this an awakening moment, or it was just something? It was just, I had this, when you were talking about it and about preparation and all, I got very worried that, I did feel for a moment as though they were a part of me, or as though they were my children, those flowers. I felt like that.
Well, it was a good moment. In Zen, there's a saying that a moment is a lifetime event.
Yes.
A moment is a lifetime event. So you had a lifetime event where the flowers became your children, and it was all good.
Yeah.
Was it a realization of some sorts?
I just felt for a moment that as though the flower bed was a part of me. And why am I wanting to remove it? And I couldn't remove it. So that's exactly what it was. And there was sense of sadness.
That's fine. That's
Yeah.
fine. Look at those flower beds next week. See how they're doing.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Yeah. But I also got worried because I'm doing two things. I was newly introduced to Buddhism just about a year back. And so I'm doing my Buddhist teachings, but I'm side by side doing my Sikh teachings also. So if you have a moment like this, awakening moment, does your guru protect you? Or this might not be awakening moment, whatever it was. Supposing somebody gets an awakening moment, does their guru protect them?
It depends what kind of moment it is. It depends what kind of moment. I'll tell you a story about Bodhichitta, and then we'll end at that. Maybe. So, a famous Indian Buddhist master, logician, Dignaga. Dignaga was at Nalanda, and he had a tremendous teacher. And as part of his role at Nalanda, he used to engage in frequent debates with non-Buddhist practitioners. And debates, as you probably are aware in the Buddhist tradition, is simply for the purpose of seeking the truth. It's not so much to establish a point of view and so on. And so there was this person who was debating with Dignaga, and then the person lost the debate and asked Dignaga if he could come back in 6 months and debate again. And Dignaga said, sure. So 6 months later, this person comes again and loses the debate again, asks for another 6 months, and Dignaga says, sure. And he comes back again. And as the debate is happening, the person starts to lose debate, and he looks at Dignaga and says, that you may be very good at debate, but what about this? And he takes a few drops of water, sprinkles it on Dignaga's robes, and Dignaga robes catches fire. I don't know if it was a water or some other fluid, but Dignaga's robe catches fire. And then this person sort of just leaves. And Dignaga is sitting there in this tremendous state of despair and sadness. Like that, I debate so that people can come to some recognition, some realization of truth. But what if their intent is just like this, where they're setting a monk's robe on fire? So Dignaga is in the state of sadness and the state of despair, to the point that he takes his graphite slate, they use it for writing arguments and stuff. He takes his graphite slate and he throws it up in the air. And he says, when the slate comes down, hits the ground and shatters, I, Buddhist monk Dignaga, would have renounced Bodhichitta. For those of you who are familiar with Indian epics, this is the moment when you get the climactic music and everything starts shaking. So Dignaga throws the slate up, and he waits and waits, and the slate is not coming. So he looks up, and Manjushri, his tutelary deity, is there holding on to the slate. The idea being that the generation of Bodhichitta, and one's commitment to Bodhichitta, is so important and so profound that at moments such as this, your tutelary deity might appear to help you protect it. Otherwise, everything else, you just observe, you think well, and you move on.
So, thank you very much, Venerable. By next time you come here, we will try our level best to be more prepared for Bodhichitta.
That'll be
I
good.
don't know whether it's going to be that of a king, ferryman, or a shepherd. I don't know. But
Any form is good.
Okay, when do you plan to come again to Delhi?
I don't know.
You don't know?
No.
Okay, so we'll wait for you then. So till then, please accept this. Thank you.
Just do the dedication. Same Chandrakirti who said, sentient beings are the cause of enlightenment. In one of his texts, when he's writing the homage verse, generally when you read the homage verse, it's either to the Buddha, the Vajrasattva, or to one of the tutelary deities. But he opened his chapters by paying homage to Bodhichitta. So this whole idea that Bodhichitta is the foundation, the cause of enlightenment. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Venerable. And 1 second before people, I haven't liked this time. Okay, so thank you, Venerable, so much. Thank you, and we hope you return again soon. We've already been blessed to have your teaching twice this year.
I think this has become my extended airport.
Yeah, usually that's the reason. We're lucky if we get a teaching, whoever is passing through. So thank you, and thank you all for joining us in person and on Zoom. For those who are first timers to the center, just a little note that we have a library, a very extensive library, and a resource section here that takes a deposit of 1,000 rupees to take out a book. We have a little store here. You can ask any of our volunteers who will be roaming around about that. There's tea and biscuits in the back. I'm forgetting something. We are a donation-based center, so we appreciate any and all donations that come to the center. Most importantly, we also have copies of Venerable's book, Running Towards Mystery, with us over there, and they're available to purchase and get signed by Venerable, who is very graciously offered to sign all our 20 copies. So,
Read at your own risk.
Yeah, I have read all of it, but yeah, highly suggest reading it. So yeah, so you can form a line over there, but first we would like to take a picture if it's okay. So whoever would like, it'll go on our social media. So whoever would like to come, hopefully all of us, can come, we can gather around here and take a ugly picture. So it's very special. And then you can, collect on the side over there if you would like to buy this microphone. Is handy. Yeah, so a little quickly if we can, we don't want to take too much of Venerable time. So we can take a quick photo. Everybody come on this side. Oh, sorry.
So I'm going to keep photographing. Thank you, everyone.